tonight we're going to get into the fossil record, and the fossils are usually one of those things that Christians are kind of afraid to dig into, if you pardon the pun. But they feel like, oh my gosh, every time you hear about a fossil, it seems to be bad news for Christianity and all of that. But hopefully tonight will be the last night you ever feel that way. The fossil record is horrifying to the evolutionist, and it's certainly edifying to the creationist. Now, I'm going to open a word in prayer. Then I'm going to, you've heard me talk about this when we were talking about molecular biology and the 5 lines of science that don't allow for macroevolution to happen. I think I referenced an article from the Ledger magazine from the year 2000 that was absolutely astounding. This molecular biologist admitting that nobody in his field believes in Darwinian evolution. Well, I pulled up that article and those quotes. So I'm going to share that with you. And if you have your notes organized in order of week or something, this goes back a couple of weeks. And I just want you to hear this before we begin the fossil record. But let's open in a word of prayer. Father, would you bless the study, Lord, for the sake of us drawing closer to you, for the sake of us realizing that when you tell us a story of a flood, you mean it, and that it really happened. And the world literally is telling that same story, that it was completely underwater some time ago. So Lord, we thank you for your truth and pray that more eyes become open to that truth, and that you would use tonight, Lord, to bless your people as we want to honor you, Lord. In your love, we do this now. In Jesus' name, amen. So, okay, getting your mind back on molecular biology just for a couple minutes. There's a molecular biologist who was working on identifying genetic controls for diseases. He was interviewed by George Kaler of the Ledger in Lynchburg, Virginia. His article was entitled The Biologist and appeared in the February 17th, 2000 edition. So one of the questions was, do you believe that the genetic information evolved? So this is the DNA information we talked about the other night. It says, do you believe that it evolved? And here's his answer. He said, George, nobody I know in my profession believes that it evolved. It was engineered by genius beyond genius, and such information could not have been written any other way. The paper and ink did not write the book. You know, think about that. We know that paper and ink doesn't write a book. There has to be an author. He's saying there's so much information in DNA that DNA can't write its own book. It needs an author to give us all this information. He said the paper and ink did not write the book. Knowing what we know, it's ridiculous to think otherwise. And so the interviewer then says, have you ever stated that in a public lecture or in any public writings? Have you ever said that out loud? Have you ever made it public? And his answer was no, I just say that it evolved. To be a molecular biologist requires one to hold on to 2 insanities at all times. Listen to this again. To be a molecular biologist requires you to hold on to 2 insanities at all times. The first insanity is that you'd be insane to believe in evolution when you can see the truth for yourself. So you'd be insane to believe in evolution when you can see the truth for yourself. And the second insanity you have to believe is that you have to say that you don't believe in evolution. I'm sorry, you have to say that, it would be insane for you to say that you believe in evolution. So the first insanity is to believe in evolution. The second insanity is to say that you don't believe in it. Now, and here's why he says that's so. He says, because all government work, research grants, papers, big college lectures, everything would stop. I'd be out of a job or relegated to the out fringes where I couldn't earn a decent living. So the interviewer then says, I hate to say it, but that sounds intellectually dishonest. And the answer he got from that was, the work that I do in genetic research is honorable. We will find the cures to many of mankind's worst diseases. But in the meantime, we have to live with the elephant in the living room. And then he's asked, what elephant? He said, the elephant is creation design. It's like an elephant in the living room. It moves around. It takes up an enormous amount of space. It loudly trumpets. It bumps into us, knocks things over, eats a ton of hay, and smells like an elephant. And yet we have to swear that it's not there. Okay? straight from the mouth of a molecular biologist. Okay, so with that, overwhelming evidence from straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, a horse that's always been a horse, by the way, never anything else. Straight from the horse's mouth, you've heard from the molecular biologist that he says, when we know what we know, nobody believes in evolution. But guess what happened in every public school setting in the country today? They taught them Darwinian evolution. Okay? Why? Because they can't allow a divine foot in the door. Remember that quote? Can't allow a divine foot in the door. All right, so anyways. Okay, now for the fossil record. Let's get our minds on fossils here for a moment. Okay, so as I try to do with you, I'm not going to give you all the great Christians in the field, because you might feel, well, those are the Christian arguments. What are the atheist arguments? I'm going to let you hear from the atheists themselves, and I'm going to let you hear from the two kingpins of evolutionary paleontology. First one, Charles Darwin. Okay, let's hear from Charles Darwin himself. Now listen, he said this. Mike, I'm on 139 if you want to show that on the screen. Even if you don't, I'm on 139. All right. He says, recognizing that the fossil record did not show gradualism. So let me make sure we know our definitions here. Gradualism is the evolutionary term for slowly becoming a new creature over millions of years. So recognizing that the fossil record did not show gradualism, Charles Darwin wrote, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediary links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." Now, Charles Darwin says that, why doesn't geology, when we study rock layers and stratum, why doesn't it show species that are slowly evolving over millions of years? He says this is the strongest objection against my theory, is the fossil record doesn't show any of these in-between species. Now keep in mind the term, the non-viability of transformational forms. Do you guys remember that, or at least want to pretend that you do for a moment? Non-viability of transitional forms. What did that mean? It means if it takes millions of years to transist from, say, from a reptile to a bird, then it would never survive that process. Why? It's going to go extinct in between losing its reptilian features and gaining its feathers and wings. It'll never survive its prey. It'll become extinct. So there should be at least some fossil evidence of the time it was transisting and becoming extinct. If they weren't becoming extinct, if the evolutionist says you're just speculating that they would become extinct in that time, then there should be millions of these in-between species. It takes millions of years to transist, and thousands of them die every year. So if you take the thousands that die every year, over millions of years, there should be billions of these fossils. Now, when Charles Darwin was looking at fossils, we admittedly did not have a complete fossil record because they had to dig with shovels and so forth. They didn't have bulldozers and so forth. But Charles Darwin said if we ever have a complete fossil record, it should show these intermediary links. Well, we now have a complete fossil record. We see everything we've ever known to exist in fossils, and none of them are in between species. So that should be an open and closed case, and I would boldly say if anybody disagrees with that, they've got a lot of explaining to do, because we have creatures at every level, and we don't have anything in between. All right. So if macroevolution were true, we would have found thousands, if not millions, of transitional fossils by now. Instead, as Stephen Jay Gould observes, now let me tell you who Stephen Jay Gould is. Stephen Jay Gould, what Richard Dawkins is to atheistic biology, Stephen Jay Gould is to atheistic paleontology. He's the top pin. He's the head guy for the atheist in the study of fossils. So here's what he said. He said, the history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. Mike, could you show him 140, please? Two features that are particularly inconsistent with gradualism. Now, that's how Stephen Jay Gould introduces this. Here's how I would introduce it. here's two here's two features that do not allow evolution to be possible. And what are these two features? The first one's called sudden appearance. So in any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. Instead, it appears all at once and fully formed. So that means when we first see a certain species appear in the fossil record, it's not becoming what we know it to have been. It's already fully what we know it to have been. So the very oldest reptile fossil we have, it's already fully a reptile. It's not becoming a reptile, it's fully a reptile. So sudden appearance, these species appear all at once and fully formed. Now what's the second characteristic that doesn't allow evolution to be true here? It's called stasis. Stasis is where most species exhibit no directional change. Directional change is from reptile to bird type of thing. So most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same way as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. So now between sudden appearance and stasis, this is what Stephen Jay Gould is saying. Sudden appearance is saying the first time we see a species appear in the fossil record, it's already fully formed and shows no directional change. And then when it goes extinct in the fossil record, we see that there's been no change along the way. It leaves the fossil record much the same way that it appeared, and any morphological change is very limited and directionless. It means it's not moving in a direction to become something else. It's more involved with cyclical change, if you remember that term. Cyclical change, that the variations that they experience, they often go right back to the way they were, and then they vary a little and go back to the way they were, if their adaptation is based on weather. Okay, if it's based on an entirely different climate change, like they move from the equator to the poles, then you'll see them go through a little bit more permanent change, like going from a short-haired dog to a long-haired dog. But it certainly still remains a dog. All right. So Stephen Jay Gould, the head guy of fossils, has said, here's two characteristics that's very inconsistent with Darwinian evolution. When we find the oldest fossils, they're already fully formed, and they don't show any directional change. And when they go extinct, there's been no directional change in the fossil record. They leave much the way that they appeared. Guess what that sounds like, folks? It sounds like our Bible. That God said, I created the animals after their kind, and they reproduce after their kind. So they stay within their kind. From the first time they come onto the earth till they go extinct, they stay their kind. This is not from Christians. These are the two biggest atheists, Charles Darwin and Stephen Jay Gould. So Gould is admitting that fossil types appear suddenly, they appear fully formed, they remain the same until extinction without any directional change, which is exactly what you would expect if you believe the Bible. If you believe what the Bible says, you would expect exactly what Stephen Jay Gould says they have. But instead of admitting defeat, instead of bowing his knee to God, here's what Stephen Jay Gould did. He proposed a theory in which there's not a bit or a shred of evidence. Just like the multiverse theory with cosmology, just like imaginary time that Stephen J. Hawking proposed. They proposed these things just to make people think that maybe there's a way to keep God out the door. Well, what Stephen Jay Gould came up with the fossil record to explain the lack of in-between species is called Punctuated Equilibria. So we'll just initial it PE. Okay, Punctuated Equilibria. Here's what Punctuated Equilibria says. It simply says this. Now, what would you say if you don't see the fossil record shows no slow, gradual change over millions of years? Because remember, there should be millions of in-between species fossils. It should be millions. Because like I said, thousands die every year, and it takes millions of years to change. Thousands times millions is billions. There should be billions of these fossils, and we're still at zero. I haven't found one of them yet. So, what's punctuated equilibria? He says maybe evolution happened faster. Maybe it happened so fast that we don't see it in the record. It's just reptiles suddenly became birds. Okay, so he's literally proposing something like this: that reptiles laid eggs, and then instead of a reptile coming out, one day a bird came out. And then, of course, all his little reptile friends would make fun of him and tease him because he's not like all the others. But it's what they're proposing here, okay? So Stephen Jay Gould was asked, well, what biological mechanism would show that that's possible? And he had absolutely no mechanism to show how it could be possible biologically to quickly go from one species to another. Now, hopefully, if you've been studying the notes this week, you'll say, well, we learned about genetic limits and we learned about molecular isolation. That's why it's impossible for these things to suddenly change from one to another. They can't gradually change, nor can they suddenly change from one thing to another. So what do they say today? They just say, well, we just have a missing link. We see things go from amphibia to reptile to mammal. We see this chain. It goes from fish to amphibia to reptile to mammal. So we have a chain, which I said last week that there really is no difference between the one on the far right, which is us, the mammal, the one on the far left, which is fish. We're just as far apart from fish as we are from reptiles. There's no progress. It's all isolated equally from each other. So what term do they use to throw off the public? They'll say it's just a missing link. We have a chain of evolution. We have a missing link. By far, it's not a missing link. It's a missing chain. There is no evolutionary chain that shows any evidence from one creature becoming an entirely different creature, no matter how much time you give it. It's not biologically possible. The whole chain is missing. Nearly all the major groups of animals known to exist appear in the fossil record abruptly. Abruptly. What does Genesis say? God created the animals and boom, there they were. They appear abruptly in the fossil record, fully formed in the strata from the Cambrian period. So when they date these rocks, we're not going to talk about dating right now in the age of these rocks, but when they date them, it comes from that Cambrian period, the Cambrian period. So what do they call the sudden appearance of life, the sudden appearance of animal life all at the same time? They call it the Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang, they call it, okay? So by far, they're not saying simple cell becomes fish life, and then eventually fish life crawl out of the sea and become amphibia, and then when they're on land long enough, they become reptiles, and when they're reptiles long enough, they become mammals. They're far from saying that now. Now they're saying it was a Cambrian explosion, a Big Bang explosion of life. It all happened at the same time, fully formed. Okay, now they'll say from that simple life, they think we evolved. Okay, but so that's their adjustment to their story. Now, the fossil evidence is completely inconsistent with Darwinian evolution, and it fits harmoniously with instantaneous creation. All right. Now, I'm going to now talk about skulls, because sometimes in our biology books in high school, we see these pictures of skulls, and we're told that this is Neanderthal or caveman or whatnot. But here's the truth about these skulls. We see skulls that seemingly develop from primitive man to modern man. But many of these missing links, as they call them, are proven mistakes or frauds. It gets very, very dark, believe it or not, in this paleontological world. There was a man at the Louvre, he was a reporter at the Louvre in Paris, and he had backdoor access to the exhibits to see how they care for them and how they preserve them and so forth. And he literally saw a man filling in a bullet hole on a skull, repairing a bullet hole on a skull. So this is a person that died from a bullet wound to the head. And so he can only be as old as guns are. He can't be much older than the gun. Then he saw on that same skull, they were putting a brow, a really wide brow across his eyes and extra material around his jaw to make it super wide. And when he was caught seeing them do that, he was run out of the Louvre and pursued by security. And he wrote a book on this, and I believe Pastor David Fine knows the book. I can't think of the name of it, but if you run into him, you can ask him. But it became quite the dark story, because he caught them manipulating a skull at one of the world's most famous museums to make it look like primitive man. So it was going to be an out and outright fraud and lie being told about the skull to make Darwinian evolution look real. So they're either proven mistakes or they are frauds. Now, Michael Denton, who wrote a book on this, he points out that 99% of biology of an organism, so 99% of what you can know of an animal from the past, resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. You don't have access to the soft tissue of that animal in a fossil. Yet 99% of what you can know about that animal comes from the soft tissue. So everything that's ever explained from a fossil about that animal, they're going on 1% of the information. So they could tell a lot of stories about that fossil. Whatever they want you to believe, they can say, because the fossil's not saying very much. Their soft tissue will tell you 99% of what can be known of that animal. So Jonathan Wells, paleontologist Jonathan Wells, said this: the fossil evidence is open to many interpretations because individual specimens can be reconstructed in a variety of ways. So they reconstruct these fossils in a variety of ways to make it tell the story that they wanted to tell. And because the fossil record cannot establish ancestor-descendant relationship, you hear that? All the times you hear this fossil here and this fossil here and how one descended from another, you cannot give ancestor-descendant relationship from the fossil record. You have to have soft tissue. Now, on the topic of soft tissue in the fossil record, if you find any soft tissue, red blood cells, anything like that, soft tissue has a half-life of 500,000 years. After something's 500,000 years old, you'll see no soft tissue whatsoever. Now, that means every fossil we found with soft tissue in it is 500,000 years old or younger. Now, if we believe in a 10,000-year-old Earth, it doesn't mean things are 500,000 years old. It just means there's no way they're over 500,000 years. They could still be 5,000 years old, okay? But we have quite a few dinosaur bones that we have red blood cells and soft tissue on those bones of the dinosaur. Now, how old does Darwinius want you to believe dinosaurs are? Their number is 65 million years. Well, we know for certain that there were some dinosaurs, at least, that were around 130 times earlier than that, within 500,000 years. And then we have our Bible that makes the bold claim that when God tells Job about Behemoth, he directly describes a brontosaurus-type dinosaur. No other animal we've ever known in the fossil record or that we've ever seen with our own eyes fits the description that God is giving those animals. And he's saying them to Job in a way that he expects Job to say, yes, I know about those animals, okay? So the idea of Job, when God describes a creature, he says, who made Behemoth or Leviathan? And when he describes those animals as a creature that can stand in a massive river current without budging. So that eliminates a whole lot of animals right there. And that its trunk is like a cedar tree. Not its trunk, its tail is like a cedar tree. So we're already down to nothing but dinosaurs. And believe it or not, skeptics will say, he's talking about a hippopotamus. He's talking about, would you ever look at a rhinoceros and go, look at his tail is like a cedar tree? No. It's like a little curl on a girl's head, for heaven's sake. Okay? It's a very insignificant tail, never to be described as a cedar tree. The only animal that fits the description God gives, which also says, I put like shields across its flesh so that your arrows can't penetrate him. And he's large and fierce and all those things. So the only thing we've ever known to fit that is a dinosaur. And the next verse does not say that Job said, what are you talking about? I never heard of such a creature. The idea is that Job is fully aware of the animal that God is describing. Okay? So there's no reason to believe in 65 million year old dinosaurs because we have their bones that have given us evidence that they could not be more than 500,000 years old. All right. Now, they'll also display either chimpanzee or ape bones to show that they look human. But that's to be expected, and hopefully you can recall something you've learned earlier in the class from this. That should be expected because when we have 4 letters of DNA that make up all of life, and we live in the same biosphere as these chimps and gorillas, and we're both land-dwelling, oxygen-breathing creatures, there's got to be similarities in the DNA because there's only 4 letters to choose from to make up a respiratory system, legs that can transgress land with the gravity pull that we have, so the muscle structures, the bone structures, the breathing structures are all got to be similar because we're living in the same environment. And there's only 4 letters to design us by. So of course there's going to be similarities in all of that. So it's expected that there's similarities in the DNA code. But what's not expected by evolutionists that we see is not the similarities, but the vast differences between, if you want to say everything came from a single cell, what about the difference between humans and bears and apes and snakes and fungi and trees and hippos and peacocks and octopi and porcupines and Venus flytraps, mildew, bacterium? Vastly different. Vastly, vastly different. And you would not expect that from one common ancestor. Is all the variety and beauty that we see in nature. So there's only 2 possibilities. Based on everything we've gone over in 7 weeks, there's 2 possibilities. Either God created us or we created God. And if somebody believes that God is a creation of our own imagination, then they must also believe, based on science, that something arose out of nothing, that order arose out of chaos, that life arose out of non-life, that intelligence arose out of non-intelligence, and that personality rose from non-personality. When the science now says that because of molecular isolation, because of cyclical change, because of irreducible complexity, because of the non-viability of transitional forms, because of genetic limits, and because of the fossil record, we could say that none of that is scientifically possible. Now, if creation were true, based on the 7 weeks of study we've had, what would our universe look like if creation were true? Well, we would have a universe that exploded into being out of nothing. We'd have a universe with over 100 finely tuned, life-enabling constants with insurmountable odds of happening. We would have lost my page. We would have life that has never been observed to arise spontaneously. That life would consist of millions of volumes of empirically detected specified complexity that can change cyclically and only within a specified range, that cannot be built or modified gradually because they're irreducibly complex. They would be made up molecularly in a way that they're isolated between the different types of life, and that leaves a fossil record behind that's fully formed when we first find it, with no directional change in it, and then disappears suddenly without any evidence of change. It's exactly what we see in our world today. All the evidence points to creation. None of the evidence points to macroevolution. So some people say this, well, why don't we compromise? Why don't we teach theistic macroevolution? Why don't we just teach the evolution and say God started it, God guided it, God, all of that? Well, here's why we shouldn't teach theistic evolution. Because why would you teach theistic evolution when we just saw there's no evidence that evolution ever happened? So why would you compromise on the Bible when the thing you're compromising with has no scientific evidence that it ever happened? Now, let's say the fossil record showed slow, gradual change over millions of years, but yet we see organisms that are irreducibly complex. And you would say, well, how could these irreducibly complex organisms form over millions of years, yet we see, let's say we saw missing links in the fossil record. So now we'd have conflicting evidence. Then I'd say maybe you should teach theistic evolution. But until there's evidence of evolution, It should be regarded as a godless attempt to keep God out of our lives by showing that we were an accident with no meaning or purpose behind us whatsoever, and that life can come from non-life, and we are just a simple accident with no destiny, no future, no hope, and we're just here to make the most of it, and then we're gone forever. That's the theory of evolution that has no evidence, thank God, to support it. All right, so that concludes the study for tonight, and as Mike told you, we'll do a little bit more on the Q&A area. So be happy to begin that with you guys now.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a simple question that just says, can you explain and give us your opinion on the gap theory?
Yes. The gap theory states that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a gap of millions of years. Okay, so Genesis 1:1 saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was created the heavens and the earth. The millions of years later, it's now telling you the story of verse 2, which would be, now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. So they would say verse 1 is just this summary statement saying, hey, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then verse 2 is, after millions of years, now let me tell you how he started creating the world and everything. Now, why do they want that millions of years gap in there? Because they'll say perhaps he began animal life and stuff like that in verse 1, and then we have all of the evolution happening before Adam ever gets here and so forth, and maybe evolution is in the animal kingdom type of thing before Adam got here, and so therefore we can explain evolution through the animal kingdom and yet keep Genesis intact. So the problem with that is, if that were true, then the problem would be we'd already have death happening before Adam's sin. And therefore the wages of sin would not be death, because death was happening before sin. So it certainly would not fit theologically in with the story.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. What can you tell us about the emerging field of proteomics?
Nothing. It's the first time I heard the word.
Yes, if that is the right word there, Richard and Shannon, let us know, but I have also not heard that word. Question number 2, do you believe demons are the spirits of the Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6?
Yeah, I personally believe the Nephilim were fallen angels of Genesis 6. And the reason being is the very Hebrew word for fall is Nephil, and Im is the plural. So Nephilim means the fallen ones. So their very name is indicating that they've fallen from something. So it seems like to me they would be fallen angels, especially because they're described, their offspring's described in extremely wicked ways, that their thoughts are only evil continuously, and that's why God floods the world. And the book of Jude speaks of angels that left their proper domain and did things against the will of God. So that would fit the Genesis 6 conclusion that the Nephilim were demonic fallen angels trying to populate the earth in a demonic way by impregnating human women. So I don't know if it's half and half, but there's a lot of scholarship on the other side that think that because it talks about the sons of God went into the daughters of men, they'll say the sons of God are not fallen angels like I think they are, but they are the sons of Seth. So Seth is the replacement for Abel when Abel's murdered. He becomes the righteous one, Seth, that opposes Cain. So they would say the sons of God would be the sons of Seth, and the daughters of men would be the daughters of Cain, the evil line type of thing. So they describe it that way. But I don't think the Bible leads us in that direction at all. So I think there's more evidence to me, especially based on the wickedness that God would destroy the earth from, that the Nephilim, especially because again they're called the fallen ones, would indeed be fallen angels.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a question here that says, would you please explain the difference between micro and macro evolution?
Yes, very, very important distinction, because the universities teach microevolution, but just call it evolution and then treat it as if they proved macroevolution. So microevolution is the small adaptations that species go through to adjust to their environment, whether it's climate change, or I shouldn't use that term, but or if it's geography changes. So if they, like I said, they go to equator to the North Pole, they're going to have to adapt to that. Or if it's seasonal, like weather, wet weather versus dry weather, like Darwin's finches did, that's microevolution. Evolution happening at a micro level. That is, we call it adaptation, because that species stays the same species also, always. It's just adapting to its environment, so it goes through slow changes. You can consider suntan microevolution. So how does your skin guard against sun exposure? It darkens, okay, to protect itself, type of thing. So but you don't become another creature when you lay out in the sun. So that would be microevolution. Macroevolution is the idea that these slow changes, if you extrapolate them out over millions of years, they'll actually become another creature. And that's what there's no science for. So microevolution is true, macroevolution is false. And I think how the universities confuse our kids is they teach microevolution, but only call it evolution. And then they mock people that don't believe it, because the kids go, I can see it for myself. I see that it happens, but they don't realize that's micro that we all believe in. They just hear it getting bashed as we don't believe in that, but we do believe in microevolution. It's clearly true, but we don't believe it is macroevolution.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question. The Cambrian explosion supposedly lasted for 13 to 25 million years. Is this true, or was it more sudden?
Well, the explosion, the Cambrian period lasted that long. The Cambrian explosion would be the moment that life came about. So that's why they're using those Big Bang terms, because it looks like it all came suddenly at the same time. The period of time that they give for Cambrian period is that amount of time, but the explosion part would be more sudden, a more sudden period of it. And again, when you say those millions of years of the Cambrian period, that's assuming the dating methods are accurate, which there's huge issues and assumptions that those dating methods are based on. And it all comes down to, was there a global flood or not? If there was a global flood, then those dating methods are clearly falsified, because they're based on the atmosphere having never changed. In the history of our atmosphere, that the carbon levels in the atmosphere never changed. So they're called uniformitarianists. They need everything to be uniform throughout history for them to be able to confidently date things. But if a global flood happened, then clearly the atmosphere changed during that, and it would usher in an ice age, which clearly we have evidence for an ice age. And that type of global flood would certainly usher in an ice age afterwards. So we have evidence of a global flood through the ice age type of thing. And if a global flood happened, then the carbon dating methods, the assumptions are built on, would be falsified. So that you couldn't trust any of them. So we're called catastrophists because we believe a catastrophe changed everything. They're called uniformitarianists because they believe everything's been the same forever.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a question here that basically says, do we know what the oldest human fossil is that has been found and actually certified without being considered a hoax? And why are there not human remains that can be found from the time of Noah's flood? What is the correct biblical position?
I think I don't know that we don't think we have tons of bones from Noah's flood. I would say this. I would think the majority of bones we have are from Noah's flood. I certainly think virtually all the fossils we've ever looked at are from Noah's flood. Because what makes a fossil? Fossils mean you had an extraordinary death and an instantaneous burial. It's the only way to be fossilized. If you just drop dead on the ground, you won't be fossilized. Your bones will just lie there on top of the ground, okay? Like if you walk through the deserts and you see the desert animals that have died, their bones are just laying there. They don't get fossilized. So fossilized is an instantaneous death followed by a burial in sediment. Then all your soft tissue rots away and the bone is left in the rock layer. And that's how we get a fossil. So every fossil we pull out, the most likely cause of death was drowning by flood and instantaneous burial by that water. Because how do you get instantaneously buried if you're not drowned in a flood where, you guys got to remember, the flood, it's not the cartoon of just 40 days and 40 nights of rain. The Bible says also that the torrents of the deep overcame the land. That means there's tremendous tsunami activity flooding the earth. So what's going to happen to sea life in those tsunamis? It's going to get thrown upon the land, they're going to die, and the ocean floor sediment is going to bury them instantaneously, and they're going to become fossils. That's why we have so many fossils. Now, this is very kind of generic, but think about this. Where are the great majority of fossils on our planet? The answer is the Middle East. What do fossils become when they're in the ground long enough? Fossil fuel, oil. Where's a great majority of oil in our world? The Middle East. Why do they have so many great proportion of fossils and oil? Because that's where a majority of life was when the flood came. All the puzzle pieces come together very nicely as a catastrophist. Isn't that a great name to have? Catastrophist. Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We understand that grant funding plays a big part in intelligent design not being taught in schools. Who is behind the funding that is so atheistic?
It's oftentimes just rich people, giving grants for this or that. It could be, companies that want to hire those graduates one day so they could be, oil producers or whatever. They could be from anywhere. Anybody can give a grant to a university. But what we don't find are people saying, I want to give a grant to a university for those that want to research creationism type of thing. Why? Because think about this. What percentage of the US population of adults were educated in the public school system? 90+%. So that means 90+% of the workforce was trained in evolution. So 90% of our scientists were trained in evolution. So therefore, it's hard to get leverage in this field. They just haven't been given both sides to look at. If we could simply teach evolution alongside creationism, I would say, from everything I've been exposed to, evolution would die out in 10 years easily. It would never be taught again. If you could just teach these side by side, people would go, this is crazy, this evolution stuff. It's not biologically viable at all. But because it's the only game in town, and now people build their careers on the only science they've ever learned, they painted themselves in a corner. And I don't think many people are humble enough to say everything I ever learned and believed is wrong. I don't think there's that level of humility out there. And that's why I love that article I started the class with tonight from the Ledger. There's a guy saying, nobody in my field believes this. You just can't say it out loud. Okay, the system's rigged against God, for sure.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. And on that note, do you feel that there are any signs the truth will be taught at secular colleges?
Well, I definitely think we're hitting an all-time low in secular colleges, which is bad news. The good news is, if you look at history, if we are at an all-time low, hopefully something's going to swing it back up in a good direction. And hopefully it's because they're seeing just how morally bankrupt the American soul is becoming, and we'll start having to look for reasons. Where's this moral bankruptcy coming from? And hopefully the church can rise up and say, we've got a few suggestions here. And hopefully that could start changing things a bit. So right now, I think I've said this before, but in 25 years of teaching high school, I no longer I no longer talk about college as something everybody should do, for sure. Today was the first day of school at Calvary, and I already, in one day, got out of my mouth that some of you aren't strong enough spiritually to go to college. And if you're not strong enough spiritually to go to college, then you should just accept whatever work you can get without a college degree, because I'd rather you go to heaven as a blue-collar worker than go to hell as a white-collar worker. So it's just that simple. And I said, you probably don't have, even with your parents, you probably don't have anybody that is daily looking out for your judgment day one day. But I said, I'm going to be daily looking out for your judgment day one day. So I might say things like, I don't suggest you go to college. You can go to college, you're spiritually strong. You're not ready. You still are caught up in the world and all that. And college is designed to sink you forever. And if I'm right about God and Judgment Day, then you will pay eternally for that. So I'll tell you the truth. I don't know how long I'll last. I don't know if I'm going to get bombarded by parents saying, don't talk to my kid like that or whatever. But quite frankly, it's just where I'm at. And it's what I think. And if I have to work, at Winn-Dixie for the rest of my life, I'll do it. But it's really bad. And I'm sure you guys have seen footage of conservative speakers trying to go to liberal colleges to speak, and they'll line the front door, not let them in, and scream them down, insult them, or throw things at them. They are violently protesting what you and I believe. In this country, they're doing that. And we are, and I hate to say it this way, but there's not much separation between us and North Korea when we start behaving this way. Because they do that there too. So.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. What geological evidence do we have supporting the flood?
Okay, let me start with this word. Everything. Everything geologically supports the flood. I just told you how a fossil's made, so the fact that there's fossils show a flood. Now we can talk about the geological columns. These columns of sedimentary rock that some of them are continents long. And you've seen pictures of them where there's dark sediment and then there's layers, and it goes from dark to lighter up the layers. And what the uniformitarianist says is that means it took millions of years in between those layers. They were laid out over millions of years. But that's not what these are showing us. If they were laid out over millions of years, that means the bottom layer was there by itself for millions of years before the next layer of rock came. And if that were true, we would see erosion in between those layers. There's no way that rock layer could be there for millions of years without erosion. But what we see is nearly no erosion in between these layers, meaning they weren't exposed to the climate for millions of years. These rock layers were therefore laid down instantaneously. Now, if they're laid down instantaneously, why are the darker layers darker? And you could probably figure it out. Because as the water recedes, water always tries to sink as low as it can. So the densest water that lasts the longest in this sediment is going to be lower, making those layers darker. And it'll clear out of the top layers first, making those layers lighter. It's exactly what you would expect if they were underwater. Here's some other evidence. We have fossils in the upper layers of not just the Grand Canyon, but of mountains. You can climb mountains and find sea life fossils in these mountains. Please explain that to me if there was no flood. How did these sea life fossils come to be? Hey, look at this. I literally have President Trump calling me right now. And I'm not going to answer because I'm talking to you. How do you like that? How do you like that? He can wait. I'll get back to him. All right, you can leave a voicemail. Now, if it's actually him, the joke's on me, but I don't think so. All right. Now, so now there's a particular whale fossil that we found on top of a mountain. I can't remember what mountain, but it's called whale on its tail, because this whale fossil is like upright on its tail, fossilized in a mountain. All I want to say is this. Please explain that to me. A whale on a mountain upright on its tail. If you're going to give me any other explanation except for some violent tsunami threw it up onto the land and instantaneously killed it and buried it, your only other explanations that I ever could think of are that this may have been a circus whale that learned to walk upright and breathe air just fine, and it just happened to die on a hike in the mountains one day, and some people came along and buried it. I don't have any other explanation. Circus whale or global flood. It's the only two options I've ever come up with. Listen, planet Earth looks exactly like a planet that was deluged with water. How did we get the Grand Canyon, guys? Do you understand when God drains the earth, he's lifting up the mountains and creating valleys so that the flood runs into the valleys that are now called the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and so on and so forth. And that's how he's draining the earth. And this is exactly what the world would look like if indeed that story were true. So, I mean, everything looks like the world was once underwater. Oh, by the way, here's another one. There's something called the Atlantic Ridge that they found, I think, in the 1940s or 50s. And the Atlantic Ridge is a mountain range on the ocean floor in between the European continent and the American continents. Right in the middle, there's this huge mountainous range on the ocean floor, bigger than any mountain range we have. And they're saying, how did the ocean floor suddenly go upward for this mountain range? The best explanation is that the waters of the ocean suddenly shot up violently and rose up in a tsunami form, and it formed this Atlantic Ridge that we see now. So it's the best explanation for the Atlantic Ridge as well. It's the best explanation for the continental divide and Pangea and all these things that we presuppose to be true based on how the earth looks. Do you notice the continents look like they used to fit together? I mean, there's sections of continents that fit together perfectly if you bring them together. And what did the Bible say? The Bible said God gathered all the land together, which means all the water was together and there's one circle of land, and these tsunamis would cause continental drift. And people say there's no explanation for the kangaroos in Africa. How would they get across the ocean if they started in the Middle East, Noah's Ark? How'd they get all the way to Africa when there's so much water? It's continental drift, man. They're just on the section of land that ended up being Africa as a drift happens. Now, how do we explain the land bridges we see? There's tremendous land bridges, especially between like Russia and Alaska. Clearly, there was a land bridge there when the water levels were lower, and animals could easily migrate from North America to Russia that way. So we know they can get from one continent to another in the past.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. I'm actually going to put you a little bit on the spot here. This is one of my personal favorite items when talking about the flood. So bear with me just a second. But if you could do me a favor and just cover this image and what it means to everyone looking at the audience. I remember you taught this to me years ago.
Yeah. So the Chinese language, being a very ancient language, what we see is, and there's books written on this. In fact, this came from one of those books. I don't know if you can read the bottom of it. Maybe it's got the credit for it there. But that's the Chinese word for boat on the top. And if you look at the lower left, you see the Chinese word for vessel. And you can see that it's part of the word for boat. You can see the Hebrew number 8, not Hebrew, gosh, slip of the tongue. Chinese letter 8 there next to it. And you can see that that's part of the word for boat. And you can see the, I almost said Hebrew again. The Chinese word for people in the lower right, and you can see that's part of the word for boat. So what is the Chinese word for boat? A vessel with 8 people on it. What is the ark? It was a vessel with 8 people on it, right? And the Chinese language is filled with that, with biblical illustrations that make up their words. There's whole books written on it. One of our international Chinese students at Calvary gave me that book. I think it's still in my classroom right now, that shows all these biblical allusions to their Chinese words. And people say, yeah, but all civilizations, you know what we find in common with all ancient civilizations? They all have a flood story. So their atheistic way of thinking about that is the Bible just borrowed from all these flood stories. Guys, just use logic. If a global flood happened, wouldn't every civilization have a story about it? How would you get away from Ham, Shem, and Japheth's ancestors as they're come off this boat Don't you think Ham, Shem, and Japheth told their kids, we were on a boat for a year that killed everybody in the world but us? And they're going to tell their kids and their kids and their kids. Pretty soon, every civilization is going to have a flood story. If every civilization didn't have a flood story, I'd be concerned. The fact that they do tells me there's a flood. Isn't it amazing they can use the fact that all civilizations agree on this to use it against us? It's unbelievable to me.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a question here that says, is the fact that death could not have existed on Earth before Adam sinning be an argument for young Earth and the universe?
Yeah, it's certainly used as a young Earth argument and so forth. But did I tell you guys why when people say, are you young Earth or old Earth, I say yes? Did I go through that with you guys? Yes. Yeah, I did. Okay. So that's why I don't really get too deep into the old Earth, young Earth argument, because I happen to believe that we're all on the same page with it. It just depends on what clock you're looking at, if you remember that argument. So I think the gap theory is used by people who want billions of years in the universe. So they use the gap theory to support that. I don't think it's necessary at all, nor do I think it fits flawlessly with all the other theology that the Bible teaches, especially about sin and death and Adam's sin. So I just find it highly unnecessary. I find it that once you get off a little bit on a biblical truth, then all the support you have for that bit that you're off on also has to be off by its very nature. So that's where I think the day-age theory and the gap theory just aren't viable alternatives. And if you realize that evolution is not a threat to being true, then you don't need those theories anyways.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. A simple question here that just says, who is your favorite apologist?
My favorite apologist philosophically is William Lane Craig. My favorite apologist scientifically would either be probably Michael Behe, probably. Yeah, I'd probably name those two. And of course, Ravi Zacharias is way, way up there. And Josh McDowell and his son, Sean McDowell, are wonderful. Kent Hovind and Eric Hovind. Eric Hovind actually visited CCA and did a chapel for us one time. It was great. They're great apologists. Eric Hovind, here's what he did. He's like this, I guess I would describe him as a highly energetic, maybe even adrenaline rush junkie type of guy. Well, he heard that, it's probably 10 years ago or so now, that the atheists were dedicating a monument to atheism in Washington, D.C. And the monument was a monument for tolerance, because the big atheist monument, the big atheist mantra is tolerance. So, and I love that that's a word, because when you're asked to tolerate something, there's an admission that what you're asked to tolerate is something not good. You're never asked to tolerate something good, are you? Nobody says, Susie's such a sweet girl, please tolerate that. But if Susie was an annoying pain in the rear end, you'd say you just got to tolerate her behavior sometimes. So toleration is always for the negative. So when they say our mantra's tolerance, it means just put up with our nonsense type of thing. Well, here's what Eric Hovind did. He went to the dedication of their monument for tolerance in Washington, D.C., and after they dedicated it, with all the people gathered around, he jumped up on top of it and stood on top of it. And then he said, I want to thank the atheist for this wonderful idea of tolerance, that you have the capacity to patiently endure the flaws of others and so forth. And he says, because I'm here to tell you about the gospel of Jesus Christ who died for your sins on the cross, and started giving the gospel. And as soon as he started giving the gospel, they started booing him, throwing things at him. And one of them shouted, you can hear it on the YouTube video, they shout, send the lions, send out the lions, type of thing towards him. You can YouTube this, Eric Hovind, atheist monument dedication type of thing, and I think you'll see this video on YouTube. And he just made the perfect point, didn't he? He says, you who are dedicating your atheist monument tolerance are intolerant of me. So you do not believe in tolerance. You only are tolerant of those who agree with you. So you don't have much of a monument here. So that was pretty impressive.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. I'm going to set the stage a little bit for the next question, and I will jump into it. So the question is regards to Ben Stein's Expelled movie, where in it he interviews Richard Dawkins, who basically says Jesus Christ of the Old Testament is angry and so on and so forth. Yet, Richard Dawkins goes on to say that it is possible that intelligent design could have had a part in the creation of the earth, just not by God. If this sort of teaching is prevalent in our colleges and universities, and professors who speak of intelligent design are getting fired, how can we as Christians effectively fight the battle to have intelligent design equally taught without retaliation?
You can't. There's no evidence that you can fight it without retaliation. And to fight it, you'd have to go back to the Scopes trials type of things and get it in court, where you're going to battle that separation between church and state, which ironically is not in our Constitution at all. But and we benefit a lot from that separation of church and state as a church. So there's some benefits of that separation that I don't want to lose, but I certainly would like it taught. To me, the best way to get it taught is simply to show the flaws in Darwinian evolution and say, based on the bad science that we know that goes into Darwinian evolution, we should teach at least an alternative theory. You don't have to teach creationism as fact, because evolution is supposed to be taught as theory, isn't it? Isn't it called the theory of evolution, not the fact of evolution? Well, if it's a theory, with any theory, you should ask, well, what are the competing theories? And the only competing theory you're going to come to is creationism. So I think that's the way to get it in. But I don't have much hope for it happening, quite frankly. So all I'm doing is trying to raise up 100 Christian kids a year to enter into the universities to be able to say, hey, I know better. This is what I learned in high school. What do you think about that, professor? And most of the kids don't have the guts to do it, but I have a few that have done it, and the professors got absolutely nowhere with those kids. And now that I can tell those stories, and hopefully that'll help encourage more kids. That and you know what we were doing at the Boca campus of Calvary for the last couple of Aprils, not this April because of obvious reasons, but April of 2019 and April of 2018, we asked that congregation to invite all their atheist friends to the campus on a certain, I think it was a Thursday night or something. And we said, all we want to do is hear all your questions. Ask us why we believe what we believe and all that, and no questions off limit. So I sat up there with a panel of 3 or 4 guys, and we just allowed any questions to be asked. And I can tell you this, every single question they had was answered. None of us, no, they didn't hear, oh, we don't know, or making some excuse. We gave them an answer that they could not refute, period. Could not be refuted. My students would show up for that, and they would marvel that I used the same arguments that I gave them in class. They're like, hey, what you told that atheist, what you taught us about. Of course it is. This is the truth. This is, I'm not hiding truth from anybody. I'm giving you the very things that the atheists cannot overcome. So they saw that for themselves. So I encourage you guys to Google debates. Google William Lane Craig debates. He's my favorite to watch. Google the guy that I can't think of his name. Google him. He's really good in debates. He's a professor with Dawkins at Oxford or Cambridge. I can't think of his name now. He's a math professor. But he takes on Dawkins all the time, and he's wonderful. But William Lane Craig, for sure, you should Google his debates with Christopher Hitchens. Those are the great ones. William Lane Craig versus Christopher Hitchens. And I give that as a final exam to my kids. They have to watch a 2-hour-long debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. And I only let them hear Christopher Hitchens. And I say, now, what would you say based on what you learned this semester? What would you say to Christopher Hitchens? And they realize I've got things that take down his argument. So they walk around feeling pretty good about themselves.
Pastor Bill, I do think the gentleman you're trying to think of, his name is John Lennox.
Thank you. Yes, John Lennox. John Lennox. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful apologist. Brilliant mind. One of the great mathematicians alive today. And he puts that great brain towards the proof of the Christian faith, and it's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Pastor Bill. We've got another question here that says, for the commandment of the Sabbath, are Christians still required to honor the Sabbath? If not, what keeps us from changing other commandments like not murdering?
God keeps us from changing any commandments. We can only not follow the Sabbath if we believe God freed us to not follow the Sabbath, which I personally think he did free us to not follow the Sabbath, because Paul seems in 2 spots in the New Testament to be very specific about not letting anybody judge you regarding, and he'll name holidays or festivals, or he'll literally name Sabbath days. Don't let anybody judge you about those days. So it says it'll mean one thing to one person, it'll mean another thing to another person, and you're not to judge each other for how you handle those things. So it's not wrong to follow a Sabbath, but it is wrong to judge people whether they follow it or not. That's what I think Paul's forbidding, is you judging anybody based on their own conscience following that Sabbath or not. So that's not changing a commandment. Please let me be clear on that. Nobody's changing the commandment. Now, great scholars that I really respect will say not even the 10 Commandments are viable today. And there are not a few of them, there's many of them that will say that. And what they mean by that is this, that when Christ sets us free, he doesn't set us free to commit sin. He sets us free to live in the true imago Dei, the true image of God, which in that image, violating those commandments is never even a thought that'll cross your mind. So what your freedom means is that you now have the capacity to prefer not to sin rather than to prefer to sin. So therefore, you don't need the law to guide you. The law is there to show you your sin. But if you don't desire the sin, you don't need the sin pointed out to you. So there's a lot of scholarship that says, no, the 10 Commandments are the only part of the Old Testament law that's still in effect today. But then they have to argue why not the Sabbath, and they'll point to Paul, saying Paul freed us from the Sabbath. What they'll say is this: whatever commandments are in the Old Testament that are repeated in the New, then those are clearly what we have to follow. If they're not included in the New, then you've been set free. Like all the ceremonial laws that are not repeated in the New, we're set free from. So you can cook a goat in its mother's milk if you want. Can you imagine that? You can do that if you wanted to. Not one of you even smiled at that. That was very depressing. All right. So I'm getting mocked over here in my own home. All right. So what I think St. Augustine said something that's very helpful here, and I think Martin Luther said something that's very helpful here. Martin Luther said that you have to understand what the purpose of the law was. Here's why God gave us the law. It was simply to show us that we cannot keep it, that we can't be holy. Even though we're under the command to be holy, we can't possibly be holy. And how does he show us that? He'll say, have no other gods before me. And then many of us go, man, I messed that one up. Don't make a graven image of me. Man, mess that up. Don't use my name in vain. Mess that up. And if you look through all the 10, even Paul says, I didn't know I was a coveter till I read, do not covet. And then when I realized that coveting was against God's law, he says that law killed me. It killed me. Why? Because of the wages of sin is death. So when I realized I committed a sin, I realized the punishment for that is death. So then I'll say, thanks be to God for Jesus Christ who sets me free from that law now, okay? Jesus died, and that death that he died was your death as a believer. That's your death that you were supposed to experience. But now you get to live eternally forever now. So the purpose of the law, Martin Luther said, was to point you to Christ, to show you that you need a Savior. You might not think you need a Savior if the law wasn't given, because you would go, look at me, everybody likes me, I'm a pretty nice person. But then when you look at the law, you go, well, I definitely violate the law, though. So now that you're a lawbreaker, you need a Savior. St. Augustine said this about your freedom now. He'll say, as far as the law goes, here's the law to follow. Love God and then do whatever you want. So as long as you start with loving God, now you're free to do whatever you want, as long as you don't violate your love for God and what you're doing, because that will become sin. If you follow your heart while loving God, then you're not going to commit a sin. You can't love God and rob somebody, right? You can't love God and call and insult somebody. You have to stop loving God the way you're supposed to actually hurt somebody in any way. So, so St. Augustine said, just love God and do whatever you want. That's your freedom.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question here about Noah's Ark. Is it feasible to say, in order to fit all animals on the ark, God called one species of each animal to the ark, and would they be very small in size? In other words, babies.
Well, we know that they would be before the age of giving birth, because what sense does it make to bring animals on? They're too old to give birth when that's going to be their whole purpose. So they were certainly young enough that they were before child-rearing age so that they would have children. So that would also affect their size. Their youth would affect their size. So I think they were smaller than their average size. But, you know, nobody that studies this stuff worries about their size. Because when you look at the dimensions of the ark that the Bible gives you, and you take the average size of an animal, you would see that there's more than enough room for all the species of animals on the earth. And the way that they spelled it out, I don't have this memorized, but they would say the average size of an animal is actually a sheep. And how many sheep fit into a boxcar of a train? And how many of those boxcar trains would fit on the 3 different levels of the ark, easily would fit all the known species of animals. So there's no room issues going on here. And I personally think, and this is just speculation as far as efficiency goes, I personally think God had them all hibernate, you know, just so there's no issues of bathroom or feeding or anything like that. Even though not all animals hibernate, but God certainly could make them all hibernate, that they would just all be sleeping for that year. But, and I think we see God has certainly put instincts in the animals. I mean, you can hear wonderful stories of homing pigeons that can fly anywhere in the world and come right back to you. You hear wonderful stories of fish that will swim across continents and go right back to the very body of water they started from. God has implanted tremendous instincts in the animal kingdom that certainly those instincts can be worked to say, I just want the 2 of you to get to this ark by this time. And I think people imagine Noah running around like crazy with a checklist trying to capture all these animals, but I certainly believe God just worked their instincts for them just to come to him. And if Evan Almighty is accurate, then that's what happened, because you can see in Evan Almighty, they all just come to him instinctively. Again, nobody's laughing. All right.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question here. How did the arena of apologists develop a firm foundation to properly give a defense of the faith and at the same time a good testimony of the gospel?
How did they develop that firm foundation? I think everything that you're going to be called to do in your life will be begun, built, edified, and completed through your study of the Word. Whatever God has for you to do will be perfected through your study of the Word. Those guys were perfected in their being able to give a testimony through their apologetics, because that's what they're called to do, and they were faithful men and women that studied the Word, and through that study of the Word they become perfected by God through connection to God, through His Word, and those very things. I found myself, even over the last 25 years or so, getting vastly different interests all within the area of Scripture in different seasons of my life. Sometimes it's apologetics, sometimes it's just books of the Bible, sometimes it's the holiness of God, and I believe because I'm staying connected to Him daily through His Word, that He puts these things in me for a season to go, learn this, know this, and then all of a sudden the events in my life play out where I needed to know those very things at those very times. So I believe that God does the faithful work that he begun in you, that'll be faithful to complete, I believe, is perfected through your study of the Word. And I think those men would probably say something very similar to that.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We've had numerous versions of this question coming through, so I'm just going to generalize it. But the question is basically, why do bad things happen in our world if God is an all-loving God? Okay. So do you know that's the single most asked question about God? The single most asked question is, if he's a loving God, why is there evil in the world? Now, here's how I used to answer it, but I think this is a part of my immaturity. I would say, you only got to read to the 3rd chapter of the whole Bible to find out why. You only got to get to chapter 3 of the whole book, and you'll see that we rebelled against God. We asked him to step away from us so we could live life our way, and this is the world, what the world looks like when you've asked God to step away. And that's still a right answer. It's just not a very deep answer. Genesis 3 says that our representative chose to listen to Satan over God. He didn't believe and trust God enough to get Satan out of the garden. Remember, Satan came in the form of an animal, and Adam received the command to rule over the animal. So Adam had the authority over that serpent, and he didn't use it. Instead, he submitted to it and disobeyed God. And we are currently in that separation from God that resulted from that sin. Now, if nothing evil came in this separation from God, then what in the world would we need God for? We would have no use for him whatsoever if everything were paradise without him. But he's showing that paradise can only happen with him and through him. That when we're left to our own devices, we are very destructive. We have evil in our hearts that has to be tamed. In fact, let me tell you guys this. David says a prayer in Psalm 139 where Psalm 139 is a beautiful psalm of David falling deeper and deeper in love with God as he meditates upon God. And one of the things that he becomes overwhelmed with in that psalm is he says, God, you put your right hand upon me. And he says that knowledge is too wonderful for me. I can't attain to it. He said, here's how we'd say it today. God, it blows my mind. It blows my mind that your hand is upon me to guide me. Now, here's what Paul says in Romans 1. He says, the wrath of God is on everyone who worships and serves the creation rather than the creator. By the way, that's the evolutionist. Worshiping the creation rather than the creator. And then he says, for what can be known of God was made known to them by God, for he himself made it known to them. In other words, he wrote his law on our hearts and minds. God did that personally to even the atheist. And that's what the truth that they're suppressing in their unrighteousness, Paul says in Romans 1. And it says, because they've done this, God turned them over to their depravity of their minds. Now, when it says he turned them over, the word picture there is he took his hand off of them. And he says, now this is going to be you unguided by me. My hand of guidance is off. And now watch what you'll do without my hand of guidance on. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that our hearts are naturally wicked and evil. And it's only through the guiding hand of God that there can be any good in the world. So when the world has largely rejected God, and by the way, obviously the great majority of evil that we think of is not done by Bible-believing, Bible-following Christians, or is it? Okay? If any of it is, it's an exception to the rule. It's certainly not the rule. Okay? So the idea of wickedness comes when God removes his hand. The idea of celebration is what David says when God puts his hand upon us to lead us and guide us. So why is there evil in the world? Because we ask God to step away, and most people walking the planet today do not have the hand of God guiding them. So now they're left to nothing to guide them but their own wicked hearts. So yes, there's going to be evil in the world. And now I would boldly say this, and I've said it many times, I'll say it again tonight. If I ever turn on the news once in my lifetime, and I turn on the news,
And that anchorman looks at the camera and says this: nothing bad happened in the world today. I will close my Bible and say, this has now been proven wrong, and I'll never read it again. Because the Bible will not allow for a day when nothing evil happens. Why? Because the world has rejected him. Jesus came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And most people are in that category. So, of course, the very natural thing for them to do by their own nature is evil. And I will not understand God or theology the day we have a day without evil. Then I don't understand this anymore. Evil to me is a great apologetic for the existence of the biblical God. The world should look exactly as we see it today, evil and all, if the Bible is correct. Is that helpful? If not, hopeless in some ways. All right. So what do, folks? We long for heaven. We yearn for heaven. We long for an eternal existence that's free from all of this stuff. And that's what keeps us faithful to Jesus in this world that we're living apart from him. Now, of course, he promises to be with the believer and all that, and that's true. That's the hand of guidance. That's your guidance. That's what conforms you into his image, as Romans tells us.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. The timing around when this question came in is kind of everything, but I think what the person was referring to was when you explained God removing his hand of protection off of the human beings, does that include items like natural disasters, him allowing natural disasters and so on to happen?
Yeah, natural disasters I don't think is quite the same in the sense that I'm talking about God removing his hand from individuals, where natural disasters would simply be God leaving this earth from the garden. When God left the garden, Paul says that even creation groans from that. So creation is groaning, longing for its redemption. So creation is in the same boat we are in that it was perfect, it was designed to be perfect, and now it groans in its imperfections, longing for the sons of men to be redeemed. So that means when we fully get redeemed and Jesus comes back and it's nothing but Jesus and all who believed in him, then what does it say? We get a new heavens and a new earth, and the groaning of the earth is done, the groaning of creation is done, and everything is in its fullest. You'll never eat a sour apple again. They're all going to be wonderful and great. Your bananas won't go bad. Everything is going to be absolutely perfect all the time. So if I'm remembering right, the question was, does God removing his hand include hurricanes and natural disasters? I mean the hand more on individuals. I think the natural disasters is just from Genesis 3 onward, that the earth is in that groaning.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have one more question, and it's just a simple question. How do we know Christianity is the religion versus all the others?
Okay. This is actually a part of this presentation, but it won't fit in the 8 weeks. But I would say this. I would say what I've gone over for the past 7 weeks, that the universe is impossible to exist without there being some sort of designer. The design of the universe is unexplainable without a designer. Life is unexplainable without a designer. I think what we're showing is God is necessary for all the science that we know. Now, that proves theism to be true. It doesn't prove Christianity to be true. It just proves theism to be true, that there is a God, there's some higher power. That's scientifically proven from the 7 weeks we spent together. Now that we established theism is true, the question is it monotheism or polytheism? Is there one God or are there many gods? Well, polytheism is impossible to know if there's more than one God. And you're like, how can it be impossible to know if there's more than one God? Because by definition, God is the fullness of all perfections. He's the fullness of all perfections. And if there's another God that's the fullness of all perfections, he would be indistinguishable from the other God because they're identical. Okay? There'd be nothing to distinguish between the two of them. So you wouldn't even know there was more than one because there'd be no differences in them. the only way to tell the difference and distinguish between them, if one of them lacked one of those moral perfections, then you could tell the difference. But as soon as he lacks the moral perfection, he's no longer God. So polytheism is self-defeating in that way. So we prove theism through all the science I gave you. That leaves us with either monotheism or polytheism. Polytheism is a logical impossibility, so that leaves us with monotheism. So we just eliminated all the polytheistic religions, and we've eliminated atheism. What hasn't been eliminated are the monotheistic religions, which is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those three religions would celebrate everything I've said in these 7 weeks. So you say, well, how do you distinguish between those three then? Well, there is a unique difference between, now we can put Christianity and Judaism together against Islam. We could say the difference that allows Christianity and Judaism to still be in the conversation, that does not allow Islam to be in the conversation, are the existence of prophecy and miracles. Islam has no prophecy, Islam has no miracles. Even Muhammad was challenged with the statement, hey, Jesus had miracles, where's your miracles to prove that you're a true prophet? He said, my miracle is the Quran. And the Quran is no miracle at all. So that leaves us with Judaism and Christianity that have prophecy and miracles, because prophecy and miracles are clearly of a supernatural character, right? They have a supernatural character to them. Okay, so that means there's got to be a higher power to work prophecy or miracles. So that leaves us with Judaism and Christianity. So how do we know which one of those is true? Well, then you have the testimony of Jesus Christ that separates it, who even his enemies acknowledged his miraculous power. The prophets, all the prophecies were about him. So, and then you observe his life and you realize that more than 300 Old Testament prophecies about him have astronomical odds against any person ever fulfilling them. And yet he fulfills them all. And then he predicts his own death by the Pharisees, because remember when he said to the Pharisees, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. That's a direct prophecy that those Pharisees will be responsible for his death. So he predicts his own death by the hands of the Pharisees, and then his own resurrection on the 3rd day. And then the testimony of the appearances of Jesus after his death are so credible because it's multiple people over vast amounts of times and vast areas with the same testimony of seeing the risen Christ, with all of them willing to pay the highest price for telling that story, which is they're willing to accept their own execution for telling that story. So that comes with the highest level of credibility that Judaism has nothing of the sorts for it. So the best explanation for all the evidence, which would be a great title for our class one day if you think about it, is Christianity. Christianity is the best explanation for everything that we've discussed, and there's way more, by the way, than just this. So because Islam and Judaism and Christianity, they all say, believe us or suffer eternally. That puts a lot of pressure on us to figure out the right one. And the way that I sleep well at night is knowing that I have the overwhelming amount of evidence in my favor. And you just can't explain away the life of Jesus Christ. You just cannot explain it away as something natural. It is clearly a supernatural life. So I think Christianity is by far, listen, when we talk about prophecy and the odds of fulfilling prophecy, there's over 300 Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. He has to fulfill every one of them or he's not who he says he is. The Bible itself says if a prophet prophesies something and it doesn't come true, then he's a false prophet and he should be killed. Okay, so you have to bat 1,000 as a prophet. 999 gets you killed in prophecy. You got to bat 1,000. So the statistics behind the fulfilled prophecies are these. Just 8 of the over 300 prophecies were given statistical odds of ever being fulfilled. The 8 included him being born in Bethlehem. Okay, any of you still in the running to be the Messiah? Anybody here born in Bethlehem? No, we're all out of the picture already. All right. So you have to be born in Bethlehem. You have to be betrayed. Has to be by a friend, not an enemy. Has to be for money. The money has to be silver. Has to be 30 pieces of it, exactly. Has to be thrown on the temple floor, and has to be gathered up again and used to buy a potter's field. You don't know anybody that's happened to except Jesus Christ. And that's just 8 of the over 300 prophecies. The odds of those 8 prophecies being fulfilled in one life is 1 times 10 to the 17th power. A 1 with 17 zeros after it. And when you ask, well, how big is that number? I can't imagine that quantity. What's that quantity? It'll take 1 times 10 to the 17th silver dollars laid down side by side by side across the entire state of Texas, 2 feet deep is that number. 1 times 10 to the 17th silver dollars laid side by side by side across the entire, every square inch of Texas, 2 feet deep is that number. There's only 1 chance in all of those silver dollars of just those 8 prophecies coming true in any one person's life. Then they did another 40 prophecies to bring it up to 48 prophecies, and the number became 1 times 10 to the 157th power. That's 3 times the number of the impossible. It's like 3 impossible events happening when 1 impossible event is impossible to ever happen. So it's more than triple the impossible. And the estimated number of molecules in our universe is somewhere between 1 times 10 to the 70th and 80th powers. So it's double the amount of molecules in the universe to 1 chance of anybody fulfilling 48. And we still have over 250 of them to go. And I don't know anybody that's done the math past 48. I've only heard up to 48. So because it's more than triple the number of the impossible, I have the right to say this now. It is mathematically impossible that Christianity is wrong. It's a mathematical impossibility. So that's how, is what I would say to the question.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. That does wrap up all the questions that we have received tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
I have one more that somebody sent me during the week. And I'm afraid I'm going to be a little disappointing on this because it's a revelation question. And what's being asked, I actually don't believe. So it's a little awkward. But they're talking about there's appointed one time for man to die, and then we face the judgment. Well, what about the rapture? People are raptured. Where's their one death? And then who lives after the 1,000-year tribulation? It's not a 1,000-year tribulation. It's actually a 1,000-year millennial reign. It's only a 7-year tribulation. But who lives after that? And is it the Jews or those that only accepted Christ? Also, we come back with Jesus on white horses. I thought we were in heaven then. Those under the altar who die for Christ, do they come back to reign with Christ for 1,000 years while we are in heaven? I'm sure I'm off somewhere. My question is, who is there in the 1,000-year reign? And so forth. And my disappointing answer is, I don't accept any of those premises. I don't hold our church's view of end times. And they know that. It's not a big secret. They just asked me not to try to sit here and change your minds on end times view. But what we can certainly do is compare the different end times views and see what's clearly biblical and what's kind of speculative about it. I'll just give you some brief understandings, okay, of my position on end times. I believe we're already in the millennium, and I know that just opened a huge can of worms. I believe the millennium started upon the death and resurrection of Christ, because I don't believe the millennium is a literal 1,000-year period. Because it's only mentioned once in the entire New Testament, to me means it's not that important to the New Testament authors, the millennial reign. And also, because it's in the book of Revelation, where it's all filled with symbolism, I believe it's symbolic. I don't believe we should take 1,000-year reign literally. I think it's symbolic of a large period of time, because the word thousands in the Bible is always used to mean just ongoing in some way. Saul is slain his thousands, David is tens of thousands. the word thousands is never meant to be a counting number. It's meant to just mean endless, a remarkably large period of time. So I believe Satan is bound right now, not universally. I think he's bound in my life because now that I receive Christ, greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. So Satan's bound in my life. He doesn't have authority over me anymore. He has authority over every non-believer. He does not have authority over me or you who have received Christ. So he's bound. That's the binding of Satan. And I believe, okay, I'm just going to tell you, and I know some of you will get upset, and some of you will say, I don't believe anything that man ever said anymore, or whatever. But it's actually the most popular end times view of the early church fathers, if that helps you. Okay, it's called Amillennialism. And I believe if you read Matthew 24, where the apostles say, when are you coming back and when's the end of the age? I think the big misunderstanding is people think the end of the age is the last days. But I think Paul clearly tells us that the end of the age was when Christ came. He'll say Christ came at the end of the age. Because what they understood the age to be is the Jewish age, is what they're asking. When is the end of the Jewish age? And that was when God had prophesied through Jeremiah and Hosea. He said, a day is coming when the people who are called my people will no longer be called my people, and the people who are not called my people will be called sons of the living God. They knew that to be the end of the Jewish age. So they're asking Jesus, when's the end of the age? Their understanding is when is the end of the Jewish age, which is what Christ brought in. That's why he weeps over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you have killed the prophets and stoned those who are sent to you. How I've longed to gather you as the hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Now your house is left to you desolate, which is a prophecy of the 70 AD destruction of the temple, which to me is the judgment of God upon Judaism, the sacrificial system, and all the things that they were doing. That's God's judgment by destroying their temple through the Romans. So I believe that 70 AD event was the 3.5-year mark of the 7-year tribulation that started in 67 AD and continued to 73 AD through the Roman siege of Jerusalem, and the pinnacle of that being halfway through with the destruction of the temple. And everything Jesus says in Matthew 24, that he's only talking to the 12 in Matthew 24. He's talking to his 12 apostles. And he says, when you see this destruction, you run to the mountains. That's not instructions for us. He's not telling us to run to the mountains when the tribulation happens and all of that. He's telling his 12 that. He keeps saying, when you see this, and you see this, and you're to do this, and you're to do this. And we automatically apply that to us. It wasn't meant for us, in my opinion. It was meant for them. Because remember how Jesus finished that teaching? He said, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen. Well, that generation passed away, and we still think it's in the future, those events. So that's why the atheists, one of their big accusations against Christianity is they'll say Jesus is clearly a false prophet. Say, how's he a false prophet? He said their generation wouldn't pass away before all those end times events happened. And you still think those end times events are in the future, but that generation's passed away. So the only way to defend that is they'll say, well, generation, he meant race. He meant the race of the Jews. Well, then Jesus wasn't very literate because he didn't say generation. He said race. They're completely different words. Okay? He said this generation will not pass away. And then they'll say, well, he meant when it happens, when it begins, then that generation that's alive when it begins, they'll still be alive when it ends. Well, the tribulation is only 7 years. That's not a phenomenal statement to make. For me to say to you, when this 7-year event begins, you'll be alive when it ends. You'd be like, yeah, I hope so. I didn't plan on dying in the 7-year period type of thing. So it's kind of a nonsensical statement for him to make. You'll still be alive at the end when it starts. So now think if you're one of the 12 and Jesus says to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Would you look at each other and go, he's talking about the people thousands of years in the future? Of course not. Because part of the instructions were, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, flee to the mountains. Well, what they understood was Jerusalem was a walled city. And usually when you get surrounded by an army, you flee into the walled city. That's why you built the walls, for safety. Jesus gives the opposite advice, and he says, flee the city and go to the mountains. Well, guess what? We know that in 67 AD, when they surrounded the city, the believing Jews listened to Jesus and fled to the mountains. And the unbelieving Jews that didn't, 1.1 million of them died in that siege because they didn't flee from the mountains, exactly as Jesus had told them. So that certainly seems to be the fulfillment of what Jesus was talking about. All right, so we're going to end on that because I can sense you cursing my name under your breath, calling me a heretic. And so I'm going to take my ball and go home with that. No, I can't do that to you. If you have any questions about that, I'll hang in there for a little while longer. I feel like I just pulled an evil trick on you. I really do. But, yeah. Hey, but let me finish with this. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, thank you so much for tonight, Pastor Bill. You did answer everyone's questions. I guess we'll end the same way we always end, which is, what are you going through in your Monday night studies?
Nowhere. We finished.
Wow, you finished. Well, that's a good segue into registration is open for your First Peter class on Calvary's website. So everyone go and register for that. We will be back here on September 9th. We do have at least one more week of apologetics left.
Yeah, we're gonna do the argument for morality, which we touched upon a bit tonight. So we're gonna show that although the atheist can be a moral person, they just can't justify their moral behavior based on their worldview. So we're going to show that the agreement of morality is a good thing demands the existence of God. So we're going to do the argument for morality to finish up our 8 weeks together next week.